The year was 1348. Margaret of Kent stood trembling in the town square of Canterbury, her wrists bound tight with coarse rope that bit into her flesh. Around her, hundreds of faces stared with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. She had been caught stealing a loaf of bread to feed her starving children during the Black Death. The punishment? Her right hand would be severed at the wrist with a rusty axe, then held high for all to see as a warning. But Margaret was one of the lucky ones. You see, when we think of medieval justice today, we imagine swift executions or perhaps a night in a dank dungeon. We picture Hollywood's sanitized version of the past, where death comes quickly and suffering is brief. The reality was far, far worse. Medieval Europe developed a sophisticated science of suffering, where punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about theater, terror, and sending a message that would echo through generations. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view human nature and the depths of cruelty our ancestors were capable of inflicting upon one another. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully crafted, legally sanctioned tortures designed by brilliant minds to extract maximum agony while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. Prepare yourself, because the most horrifying punishments of medieval Europe weren't just worse than you imagine. They were worse than you could possibly conceive. Before we dive into the nightmarish catalog of medieval punishments, we need to understand why they existed in the first place. Medieval justice wasn't just about punishing crime. It was about creating a spectacle so terrifying that the mere thought of it would prevent others from committing similar acts. In a world without television, newspapers, or social media, public executions and tortures were the ultimate form of mass communication. They were carefully choreographed performances designed to reach the deepest, most primitive parts of the human psyche. The authorities understood something that modern psychology has only recently rediscovered. Fear is one of the most powerful motivators in human behavior. Consider the case of William Wallace, the Scottish knight who dared to defy English rule. His execution in 1305 wasn't just meant to end his life. It was designed to send a message to every Scotsman who might consider rebellion. Wallace was dragged naked through the streets of London behind horses, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still alive. What happened next defies comprehension. His abdomen was sliced open, and his intestines were pulled out and burned before his eyes while he was still conscious. His genitals were cut off. Only then was he beheaded and his body carved into quarters, with each piece sent to a different corner of Scotland as a warning. The entire process took hours, and Wallace remained conscious for most of it. But Wallace's execution, horrific as it was, represented just one category of medieval punishment. The medieval mind had developed an entire taxonomy of suffering, each method carefully designed for different crimes and different messages. Theft called for mutilation. Treason demanded the most extreme agony possible. Heresy required not just death, but the complete destruction of the soul itself. The tools of this trade weren't crude instruments wielded by savage barbarians. They were precision devices, crafted by skilled artisans who took pride in their work. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the breaking wheel, each represented centuries of refinement in the art of inflicting pain. These devices were passed down from generation to generation, improved and perfected like any other craft. Medieval executioners weren't bloodthirsty monsters either. They were highly trained professionals who often came from families that had practiced the trade for generations. They understood anatomy better than most physicians of their time, knowing exactly where to cut to cause maximum pain without causing immediate death. They were paid well for their expertise and held a strange position in society, simultaneously feared and respected. The locations of these punishments were equally important. Town squares, crossroads, and hilltops were chosen not just for visibility, but for symbolic meaning. These were places where the entire community could gather, where the social order could be reinforced through shared witnessing of ultimate consequences. What made medieval punishments truly horrifying wasn't just their physical brutality, it was their psychological sophistication. The authorities understood that anticipation often caused more suffering than the actual punishment. Condemned prisoners were often kept in sight of their execution devices for days or weeks, forced to contemplate their fate. The mental torture began long before the physical torture ever started. Among the most diabolical inventions of medieval justice was a device so cruel that its very name sends shivers down the spine: the Judas Cradle. Also known as the Judas chair, this instrument of torture represented the pinnacle of medieval ingenuity in the art of prolonged suffering. Picture a pyramid-shaped seat, sharpened to a point at the top. The victim would be slowly lowered onto this point, which would penetrate their body through the rectum or vagina. The weight of their own body would cause them to sink deeper onto the spike, but the torture could be prolonged for hours or even days by adjusting the ropes that supported them. The genius of the Judas Cradle wasn't just in its physical design, it was in its psychological impact. The victim could see their fate approaching. They knew that every moment of relief was temporary, that gravity itself had become their enemy. Some victims would beg for death within minutes, but death could be delayed for an extraordinarily long time if the torturer was skilled. What made this device particularly sinister was that it was often used for extracting confessions. The victim would be positioned above the cradle while questions were asked. With each unsatisfactory answer, they would be lowered just a little bit more. The anticipation of that final, fatal descent often broke people before the device even touched them. But the Judas Cradle was just one instrument in an orchestra of agony. The Iron Maiden, despite being somewhat mythologized in popular culture, was indeed used in various forms throughout medieval Europe. This coffin-shaped device was lined with iron spikes positioned so that when the victim was sealed inside, the spikes would pierce their body without hitting vital organs immediately. The true horror of the Iron Maiden wasn't the spikes themselves. It was the slow death they provided. Victims could survive for hours or even days inside, bleeding from dozens of wounds while unable to move or escape. Some versions had spikes positioned specifically to pierce the eyes, while others had openings that allowed torturers to periodically check on their victim's condition. The breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, represented another category of medieval punishment, the public spectacle. This large wooden wheel was used to break the bones of condemned criminals in a specific ritualized manner. The victim would be tied spread-eagle to the wheel, and then the executioner would use an iron bar to methodically break their bones, starting with the limbs and working inward. The breaking process followed a precise pattern. First the bones of the arms and legs, then the ribs, then finally the spine. Between each break, there would be a pause to allow the crowd to appreciate the victim's screams and to let the full agony set in. A skilled executioner could keep a victim alive and conscious throughout the entire process, which could take hours to complete. Once all the bones were broken, the victim, still alive, would be woven through the spokes of the wheel and left to die from exposure, dehydration, and their injuries. This could take days, during which time the wheel would be displayed prominently as a warning to others. Some victims were granted the mercy of having their heart or throat crushed after a certain period, but this was considered a privilege, not a right. The pear of anguish was perhaps the most intimate of medieval torture devices. This pear-shaped instrument was made of metal segments that could be expanded by turning a screw. It would be inserted into the victim's mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on their crime. Blasphemers received it orally, homosexuals anally, and adulteresses vaginally. As the screw was turned, the pear would expand, tearing internal tissues and breaking bones. The device was designed so that it could be expanded to cause maximum pain without immediately killing the victim. The psychological component was crucial here too. Victims knew that their suffering was directly tied to the crime they had committed, making the torture feel like a twisted form of poetic justice. These devices weren't used randomly or carelessly. Medieval law prescribed specific tortures for specific crimes, and there was a horrible logic to it all. The punishment was meant to fit not just the crime, but the criminal's place in society. A noble might face beheading, quick and relatively merciful, while a peasant guilty of the same crime might face something far worse. Medieval torture wasn't the product of random cruelty or uncontrolled rage. It was a science, complete with its own body of knowledge, techniques passed down through generations, and continuous innovation in the pursuit of maximum suffering. Professional torturers were among the most skilled artisans of their time, and their expertise was valued by the authorities who employed them. The foundation of medieval torture science was anatomical knowledge. Professional torturers understood the human body better than most physicians. They knew which bones could be broken without immediately killing their subject, which organs could be damaged while maintaining consciousness, and how to inflict maximum pain while preserving life for as long as possible. This knowledge wasn't written down in textbooks, but it was carefully preserved through apprenticeship systems. Young men would spend years learning from master torturers, starting with simple tasks like maintaining equipment and preparing victims, gradually working their way up to performing the most complex procedures themselves. The tools of their trade were marvels of medieval engineering. Take the rack, for instance. This seemingly simple device, basically a rectangular frame with rollers at each end, was actually a precision instrument. The rollers were geared to allow for minute adjustments in tension. A skilled operator could stretch a victim's joints to the exact point of dislocation without fully separating them, maintaining maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and able to speak. Master torturers developed techniques for using the rack that could prolong suffering for hours. They understood that joints dislocated in a specific sequence would cause different types of pain, and they could orchestrate a symphony of agony by carefully controlling which joints were stressed at which times. Some could stretch a victim's body by several inches without killing them. The thumbscrews or pillowinks represented another category of precision torture instrument. These devices could apply gradually increasing pressure to fingers, toes, or other small body parts. The key was in the threading of the screws, which allowed for incredibly fine adjustments in pressure. A victim could be kept at the exact threshold between consciousness and unconsciousness for extended periods. But perhaps the most sophisticated torture technique was the water torture, later refined by the Spanish Inquisition but originating in medieval secular courts. This method involved forcing water into the victim's mouth and nose using a funnel, creating the sensation of drowning without actually drowning them. The victim's body would be tilted at specific angles to maximize the terror while minimizing the actual risk of death. The psychological aspects of medieval torture were just as sophisticated as the physical techniques. Professional torturers understood that fear and anticipation could cause more suffering than physical pain alone. They developed elaborate rituals around torture sessions, designed to maximize psychological impact. Victims would often be forced to watch other tortures before their own session began. They would be shown the instruments that would be used on them, with detailed explanations of how each one worked. Sometimes they would be made to help prepare their own torture devices, creating a sense of complicity in their own suffering. The timing of torture was carefully calibrated. Sessions would begin slowly, with minor discomforts that gradually escalated. This served multiple purposes. It allowed the torturer to gauge the victim's pain tolerance, it prolonged the overall experience, and it created hope in the victim that perhaps the worst was behind them, hope that would then be cruelly shattered as the torture intensified. Professional torturers also understood the importance of keeping their subjects conscious and responsive. They developed techniques for reviving unconscious victims, including the use of ammonia-like substances and specific types of physical stimulation. A victim who passed out from pain was temporarily useless for both confession extraction and public deterrence. The most skilled torturers could read their subjects like books. They understood that different people responded to different types of pain, and they could adjust their techniques accordingly. Some victims were more susceptible to sharp pain, others to pressure, still others to heat or cold. A master torturer could quickly identify a subject's particular vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical precision. Record-keeping was another crucial aspect of the torture science. Detailed notes were kept about which techniques worked best on which types of subjects, how long various procedures could be maintained without causing death, and which combinations of tortures were most effective for extracting confessions. This institutional memory allowed the craft to be refined over generations. Among all the horrific devices conceived by the medieval mind, few captured the imagination quite like fire-based tortures. There was something primal about death by fire that spoke to the deepest human fears, which made these punishments particularly effective as deterrents. But the medieval practitioners of fire torture elevated what could have been simple burning into an art form of prolonged agony. The Brazen Bull, though originally an ancient Greek invention, found renewed popularity in medieval Europe. This hollow bronze sculpture of a bull was designed with a door in its side through which victims could be loaded. Once sealed inside, a fire would be lit beneath the bull, slowly heating the bronze until the interior became an oven. The genius of the Brazen Bull wasn't just in its method of killing, but in its acoustic properties. The device was designed with a system of tubes and stops that transformed the victim's screams into sounds resembling the bellowing of an actual bull. This served a dual purpose. It dehumanized the victim in the minds of the spectators while creating an almost supernatural atmosphere that enhanced the terror of the punishment. What made this torture particularly cruel was its gradual nature. The bronze would heat slowly, giving the victim time to understand their fate. They would first feel uncomfortable warmth, then growing heat, then burning. As the metal reached higher temperatures, they would literally be roasted alive, their screams echoing from within the bull as increasingly inhuman sounds. Some versions of the Brazen Bull were equipped with viewing ports that allowed spectators to watch the victim's final moments. The sight of a human being slowly cooking while trapped in an inescapable bronze prison was designed to create trauma in witnesses that would last for the rest of their lives. Fire tortures took many other forms as well. One particularly cruel method involved coating the victim's feet with lard or oil, then slowly roasting them over an open flame. This technique could be prolonged for hours, as the fat would protect the flesh from immediate burning while conducting heat deep into the tissue. Victims would often beg for their captors to increase the heat to end their suffering more quickly. The iron boot was another fire-based torture device that demonstrated the medieval mastery of prolonged suffering. This device encased the victim's foot and lower leg in iron, which would then be gradually heated. As the metal warmed, it would expand slightly, creating increasing pressure while simultaneously burning the flesh. The combination of crushing and burning could be sustained for hours without killing the victim. Brand torture represented a more surgical approach to fire-based punishment. Rather than seeking to kill the victim, branding was designed to mark them permanently while causing excruciating pain. Professional branders understood exactly how long to hold a red-hot iron against flesh to create a clear, permanent mark without causing fatal injuries. The brands themselves were often elaborate designs that indicated the victim's crime, turning their body into a permanent record of their transgression. The most sophisticated branding techniques involved multiple sessions over several days or weeks. A victim might receive a small brand each day, allowing them to fully experience and recover from each burning before the next one was applied. This technique was particularly popular for crimes like adultery or theft, where the goal was to shame the victim rather than kill them. Fire wasn't just used as a direct torture method. It was also used to heat other torture devices to enhance their effectiveness. The Judas cradle could be heated until it glowed red hot. Iron spikes could be warmed before being driven into flesh. Even simple shackles could become instruments of additional torture when heated and clamped onto a victim's wrists or ankles. The psychological impact of fire torture was perhaps even more powerful than its physical effects. Fire represents one of humanity's most primal fears, something that's embedded deep in our evolutionary history. The sight, sound, and smell of burning human flesh created trauma not just in the victim, but in everyone who witnessed it. Medieval authorities understood this psychological dimension and exploited it ruthlessly. Fire tortures were often performed at night, when the flames would be more visible and the shadows they cast would be more dramatic. The smell of burning flesh would linger in the air for hours after the torture ended, serving as a continuing reminder of what had transpired. Some fire tortures were designed to be almost ceremonial in nature. The victim would be dressed in special garments soaked in flammable substances that would burn in specific patterns. This created a ritualistic atmosphere that enhanced the terror while also providing a form of grim entertainment for the spectators. The mercy stroke, a quick death blow delivered when the torturer decided the victim had suffered enough, was often withheld from fire torture victims. The nature of burning made it difficult to deliver a clean killing blow, and besides, the point of these punishments was often to let the victim die slowly from their injuries. This could take days, during which time they would serve as a living example of the consequences of defying authority. If medieval Europe had a signature punishment, one torture that epitomized everything terrifying about medieval justice, it would be drawing and quartering. This wasn't just an execution method, it was a complete annihilation of the human being, designed to destroy not just the body but the very concept of the person who had committed the crime. The full name of this punishment was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and each word represented a separate phase of agony. But even this description doesn't capture the full horror of what actually happened to victims of this ultimate sanction. The process began with the victim being dragged to the place of execution. Not walked, not carried, dragged. They would be tied to a horse or a wooden hurdle and pulled through the streets, their body bouncing and scraping against cobblestones, collecting dirt, filth, and injuries along the way. This journey could take hours, and by the time they reached the execution site, they might already be half dead from the trauma. But this was just the beginning. Once at the execution site, the victim would be hanged, but not until dead. The hanging was carefully controlled to bring the person to the very edge of death without crossing the line. They would be lifted by the neck until they lost consciousness from strangulation, their body convulsing as it fought for air, their face turning purple, their eyes bulging. Then, just before death, they would be cut down. The revival process was almost as cruel as the hanging itself. Cold water would be thrown on the victim, ammonia-like substances would be waved under their nose, and they would be slapped and beaten until consciousness returned. The moment of awakening must have been indescribable terror, the realization that the hanging was over but their suffering had barely begun. The drawing phase came next, and this was where the true artistry of medieval cruelty revealed itself. While the victim was still alive and conscious, their abdomen would be cut open with a sharp knife. The incision would be made carefully, deep enough to penetrate the abdominal wall but not so deep as to immediately damage vital organs. The executioner would then reach into the victim's body cavity and begin to draw out their intestines. This process was done slowly, carefully, with the intestines being pulled out loop by loop while the victim watched and felt every inch being removed from their body. The intestines would then be burned in a fire that had been prepared nearby, often while still attached to the victim's body. But the torturers weren't finished yet. The victim's genitals would be cut off and thrown into the fire as well. For male victims, this included both the penis and testicles. For the rare female victim of this punishment, the process was adapted but no less brutal. The burning of these body parts while the victim watched was meant to destroy not just their physical form but their very identity as a sexual being. Throughout all of this, the victim remained conscious. Medieval executioners were skilled at keeping their subjects alive and aware during procedures that should have killed them immediately. They understood how to cut without severing major arteries, how to remove organs without causing immediate death, and how to manage blood loss to prolong the victim's consciousness. Only after all of this would the victim finally be beheaded. But even death didn't end their punishment. The body would then be divided into 4 parts, quartered, with each limb being separated from the torso. This was done with axes or heavy knives, requiring multiple blows to sever the large bones and thick muscles of the arms and legs. The final insult was the disposal of the remains. The head and the 4 quarters of the body would be sent to different locations throughout the kingdom to be displayed as warnings. They might be mounted on spikes at city gates, hung from bridges, or nailed to the walls of important buildings. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who commit the most serious crimes against the crown. The head, being the most recognizable part, would often be preserved in tar to prevent decay and then displayed in the most prominent location possible. London Bridge became famous for the collection of heads mounted on spikes above its gates. These gruesome trophies could remain on display for years, serving as constant reminders of the price of defiance. What made drawing and quartering particularly effective as a deterrent wasn't just its brutality, it was its completeness. Other execution methods might destroy the body, but drawing and quartering destroyed the person's very humanity. By the end of the process, what had once been a human being was reduced to scattered pieces of meat, displayed like hunting trophies. The psychological impact on witnesses was profound and lasting. People who watched a drawing and quartering were traumatized for life. They would carry the memory of those screams, that smell, those sights with them forever. This wasn't accidental, it was the entire point of the exercise. While many medieval tortures focused on stretching, cutting, or burning the human body, an entirely different category of punishment explored the opposite approach: compression. These devices worked on the principle that the human body could be forced into positions and configurations that created unbearable agony while still maintaining life. The most infamous of these compression tortures was known as the Scavenger's Daughter. The Scavenger's Daughter was invented by Sir Leonard Skeffington, a lieutenant of the Tower of London, during the reign of Henry VIII. Unlike the rack, which stretched the body apart, this device compressed the victim into an impossibly small space. It consisted of metal loops and hinges that forced the victim into a crouched position, with their knees pressed against their chest, their arms wrapped around their legs, and their entire body folded into a space roughly the size of a large barrel. The initial positioning in the Scavenger's Daughter was merely uncomfortable, but as time passed, the compression became unbearable. Blood circulation would be cut off to various parts of the body, causing excruciating pain as limbs fell asleep and then began to feel like they were on fire. The compressed position made breathing extremely difficult, creating a sensation of slow suffocation that could last for hours. But the true cruelty of the Scavenger's Daughter became apparent over extended periods. As blood flow was restricted and muscles cramped into unnatural positions, victims would begin to hemorrhage internally. Blood would often pour from their nose and mouth as vessels burst under the pressure. Some victims would bleed from their fingernails and pores as their cardiovascular system was overwhelmed by the unnatural compression. The device was designed so that the victim could neither fully lose consciousness nor find any position of relief. Every attempt to shift weight or adjust position only increased the pain. The psychological torture was as intense as the physical. Victims knew that they were trapped in a position that would eventually kill them, but death would come slowly, over many hours of increasing agony. Master torturers developed techniques for using the scavenger's daughter that could extend the victim's suffering for days. By occasionally loosening the device to restore circulation, then reapplying it before the victim could fully recover, they could repeat the compression process multiple times. Each cycle would be more agonizing than the last, as the body's ability to cope with the trauma diminished. The Spanish boot represented another category of compression torture, focused specifically on the feet and lower legs. This device consisted of metal plates that could be tightened around the victim's leg using screws or wedges. As pressure was applied, the metal plates would slowly crush the bones and soft tissue of the foot and ankle. The Spanish boot was often used in conjunction with other tortures, as it could be applied while the victim was subjected to questioning or other procedures. The gradual increase in pressure meant that the torture could be precisely controlled. A few turns of the screw could increase the agony without immediately incapacitating the victim. Skilled practitioners of the Spanish boot understood the anatomy of the foot and ankle well enough to crush bones in a specific sequence. They would typically begin with the smaller bones of the toes, then progress to the arch of the foot, and finally to the larger bones of the ankle. Each stage produced a different quality of pain and different sounds of breaking bone that served to terrorize both the victim and any witnesses. The head crusher was perhaps the most psychologically terrifying of all compression devices. This instrument consisted of a metal cap that fit over the victim's skull and a plate that pressed against their chin. A screw mechanism would slowly force these two pieces together, gradually crushing the victim's head. The progression of agony in the head crusher was particularly systematic. First, the victim would feel pressure on their skull and jaw. Then, as the pressure increased, their teeth would begin to crack and break. The jawbone would start to fracture, sending shooting pains through their entire head. Finally, if the torture continued, the skull itself would begin to crack. What made the head crusher especially cruel was that victims could feel and hear their own skull breaking. The sound of cracking bone would reverberate through their head as the pressure increased. Some victims would beg for the device to be tightened more quickly to end their suffering, but skilled torturers would maintain the pressure at levels that caused maximum pain without immediately killing. The breast ripper was a compression device specifically designed for women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or other moral crimes. This instrument consisted of 4 metal claws that would be heated red hot and then used to grip the victim's breasts. The claws could then be pulled, tearing the flesh away from the chest wall, or they could be slowly tightened to crush the breast tissue. The psychological component of the breast ripper was particularly cruel, as it attacked the victim's femininity and identity as a woman. The torture was often performed in public, adding humiliation to the physical agony. Some versions of the device were designed to be worn by the victim for extended periods, creating ongoing pain and serving as a visible mark of shame. Compression tortures were particularly effective because they exploited the body's own structure against itself. Unlike cutting or burning tortures that introduced foreign elements to cause pain, compression devices used the victim's bones, muscles, and circulation system as the instruments of their own destruction. This created a unique type of agony that was both physical and psychological. The victim's own body became their enemy. Medieval Europe was a deeply religious society, and nowhere was the cruelty of medieval justice more evident than in the punishments designed specifically for religious crimes. Heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft weren't just seen as crimes against the state. They were viewed as attacks on the very fabric of reality, deserving punishments that would purify the soul while destroying the body. The Heretic's fork was one of the most psychologically sophisticated torture devices ever created. This simple-looking instrument consisted of a metal fork with sharp prongs on both ends, attached to a leather strap that went around the victim's neck. One set of prongs would be positioned under the chin, pointing upward, while the other set pointed downward against the chest. The victim would be forced to hold their head in one exact position, chin up, looking toward heaven. Any movement of the head would drive the prongs deeper into their flesh. They couldn't lower their chin to look down, they couldn't turn their head to either side, and they couldn't tilt it back. The only direction they could look was up, toward God, which was considered symbolically appropriate for someone who had offended against divine law. But the heretic's fork was more than just a restraint device. It was designed to prevent the victim from speaking coherently. The prongs under the chin made it impossible to move the jaw normally, reducing any attempts at speech to inarticulate mumbles. This served multiple purposes. It prevented the heretic from spreading their dangerous ideas even during their torture, and it reduced them to making sounds that seemed less than human. Victims of the heretic's fork would be kept in this position for days or even weeks. They couldn't eat solid food, couldn't drink easily, and couldn't rest their head in any natural position. Sleep became impossible, as any relaxation would drive the prongs deeper into their flesh. The constant strain on the neck muscles would eventually cause severe cramping and spasms that only increased the agony. The branks, or scold's bridle, represented another category of religiously inspired punishment device. This iron cage was designed to fit over a woman's head, with a metal plate or spike positioned to hold down the tongue. It was primarily used to punish women accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking out against religious or secular authority. The psychological cruelty of the branks was profound. It attacked the victim's ability to communicate, one of the most fundamental human faculties. Some versions included bells that would ring whenever the victim tried to speak, drawing attention to their shame and making it impossible for them to suffer in privacy. The victim would be forced to wear the device for set periods, sometimes while being paraded through town so that everyone could witness their humiliation. But perhaps no religious punishment was more feared than the auto de fe, the public burning of heretics that became the signature punishment of the Spanish Inquisition. These weren't simple executions. They were elaborate ceremonies designed to demonstrate the triumph of true faith over heretical beliefs. The auto de fe began long before the actual burning. Condemned heretics would be dressed in distinctive garments called sanbenitos, which were yellow robes painted with demons, flames, and other symbols of their damnation. They would be forced to wear tall pointed caps called carrozas, also decorated with infernal imagery. This costume served to mark them as enemies of God while also dehumanizing them in the eyes of the crowd. The procession to the burning site was itself a form of psychological torture. The condemned would be forced to walk through streets lined with thousands of spectators, carrying candles and listening to prayers for their souls. They would be constantly reminded that they could still save themselves by confessing their crimes and accepting true faith. But they would also know that this confession would not save their lives, only their souls. The actual burning was carried out with the same precision that characterized all medieval torture. The pyre would be built to burn hot but not too quickly, ensuring that death came from smoke inhalation rather than immediate incineration. However, for the most stubborn heretics, special arrangements would be made to prolong their suffering. Green wood might be used to create more smoke and a slower burn, or the victim might be positioned to burn from the feet up. Some condemned heretics were granted the mercy of being strangled before the flames reached them, but this was reserved for those who recanted their heresies at the last moment. The truly defiant would be burned alive, fully conscious, while thousands watched and cheered. The spectacle was designed to be both entertaining and terrifying, reinforcing social norms while providing a form of communal catharsis. The Judas cradle, which we discussed earlier, took on special significance when used for religious crimes. The device's name itself referenced the ultimate betrayer of Christ, making it particularly appropriate for those who had betrayed their faith. The slow, penetrating agony was seen as symbolically appropriate. The heretic was being penetrated by the consequences of their own spiritual corruption. Water torture, when used against accused witches and heretics, took on additional symbolic meaning. Water was considered a purifying element, so forcing it into the victim's body was seen as an attempt to wash away their spiritual corruption. The fact that this purification was agonizing and potentially fatal was considered evidence of how deeply the corruption had taken root. The swimming test for accused witches represented a different approach to religious punishment. The victim would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. If they sank, they were innocent, though they might drown in the process of proving it. If they floated, they were guilty of witchcraft and would be executed. This test was based on the belief that water, as a pure Christian element, would reject the corrupted body of a witch. As we reach the end of our journey through the nightmarish landscape of medieval punishment, we're left with a disturbing question. What does this catalog of cruelty tell us about human nature itself? The men and women who designed these tortures weren't monsters from another species. They were human beings like us, with families, hopes, and dreams. They went to church, loved their children, and probably considered themselves moral, upstanding members of their communities. Yet they were capable of conceiving and implementing tortures that seemed to exceed the bounds of human imagination. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that these punishments weren't the products of random sadism or uncontrolled rage. They were systematic, scientific, and legal. They represented the official policy of governments and religious institutions. They were supported by elaborate philosophical and theological justifications that made them seem not just acceptable but necessary. The medieval mind didn't see these punishments as evidence of human cruelty. They saw them as evidence of human justice. The greater the crime, the greater the punishment needed to balance the cosmic scales. The more public the offense, the more public the retribution needed to be. In their worldview, these tortures weren't excessive. They were proportionate responses to crimes that threatened the very foundation of society. This systematic approach to suffering reveals something profound about human psychology. We like to think that cruelty is the exception, that it requires special circumstances or abnormal individuals. But the history of medieval punishment suggests otherwise. It suggests that the capacity for extreme cruelty lies dormant in ordinary people, waiting for the right social conditions to bring it to the surface. The crowds who gathered to watch these spectacles weren't forced to attend. They came willingly, often bringing their families, treating executions and tortures as entertainment. Children would be lifted onto their parents' shoulders for a better view of someone being broken on the wheel. Vendors would sell food and drink to the crowds, turning human suffering into a commercial opportunity. This wasn't unique to medieval Europe. Every human society has developed its own methods of punishment, its own ways of dealing with those who violate social norms. What varied wasn't the existence of punishment, but the specific forms it took and the philosophical justifications provided for it. The rack and the Iron Maiden were European inventions, but the impulse behind them, the desire to make wrongdoers suffer as payment for their crimes, is universal. Yet there's another side to this dark history that's worth considering. These punishments eventually became so extreme, so obviously disproportionate to the crimes they were meant to address, that they generated their own opposition. The Enlightenment movement that swept through Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries was, in many ways, a reaction against the excesses of medieval justice. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria began to argue that punishment should be swift, certain, and proportionate rather than spectacular and cruel. They pointed out that the elaborate tortures of the medieval period hadn't actually succeeded in eliminating crime. They had simply created a culture of violence that brutalized everyone involved, from the victims to the executioners to the spectators. The gradual abandonment of these extreme punishments represented a kind of moral evolution. Societies slowly came to realize that the cure had become worse than the disease, that their methods of preventing cruelty had themselves become the greatest source of cruelty in their world. But this evolution wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't permanent. The 20th century showed us that supposedly civilized societies could still descend into systematic cruelty that rivaled or exceeded anything the medieval world had produced. The concentration camps of Nazi Germany, the gulags of Soviet Russia, the killing fields of Cambodia. All of these demonstrated that the human capacity for organized brutality hadn't disappeared, merely changed its forms. Today, we look back at medieval punishments with horror and incomprehension. We wonder how people could have been so cruel, how they could have justified such extreme measures. But future generations may look back at our own time with similar bewilderment, wondering how we could have tolerated the forms of suffering that we consider normal or acceptable. The true lesson of medieval punishment isn't that people in the past were more cruel than people today. It's that human beings are capable of justifying almost anything if the social conditions are right, if the proper authorities endorse it, and if enough people participate to make it seem normal. The tortures we've described weren't aberrations. They were the logical products of their time and place, just as our own approaches to justice are the logical products of ours. Perhaps the most horrifying realization is that the medieval torturers genuinely believed they were doing good. They thought they were protecting society, upholding moral standards, and serving God's will. They slept peacefully at night, confident that they were righteous men performing necessary work. The road to hell, as the saying goes, is paved with good intentions. This should give us pause when we consider our own certainties, our own moral judgments, and our own approaches to dealing with those who transgress against social norms. The people who designed the Judas cradle and perfected the techniques of drawing and quartering were absolutely convinced of their own righteousness. They had elaborate philosophical and religious justifications for everything they did. They considered themselves the guardians of civilization itself. Yet from our perspective, they were the barbarians. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what are we doing today that future generations will look back on with the same horror and incomprehension that we feel when we contemplate medieval torture? What practices that we consider normal or even necessary will seem to them like evidence of our own barbarism? History suggests that every generation has its blind spots, its accepted cruelties that later ages will condemn. The challenge is to identify and address these blind spots before we become the subjects of future historians' horrified fascination. In the end, the most terrifying thing about medieval punishment isn't the ingenuity of the devices or the extremity of the suffering they produced. It's the reminder they provide that human beings, people fundamentally like us, are capable of creating systematic hells on earth while convincing themselves they're building heaven. The screams that echoed through medieval town squares have long since faded into silence. The racks and iron maidens have been relegated to museums, displayed as curiosities from a darker age. But the capacity that created them remains with us still, waiting in the shadows of human nature for the right combination of fear, certainty, and social permission to emerge once again. The screams that echoed through medieval town squares have long since faded into silence. The racks and iron maidens have been relegated to museums, displayed as curiosities from a darker age. But the capacity that created them remains with us still, waiting in the shadows of human nature for the right combination of fear, certainty, and social permission to emerge once again. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.